Miss Marple and the Cottage, Where Laughter Turned to Screams. Chapter 1. The Garden, Piatti Weather. Late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the lawn of Bramble Cottage, where Mrs. Cecilia Hartwell had arranged what she considered to be the social event of the season in St. Mary Mead. White-clothed tables dotted the garden like islands in a sea of emerald grass, each laden with delicate sandwiches, scones, and an impressive selection of cakes that had been the subject of considerable competition among the village ladies. Miss Jane Marple sat in her customary wicker chair beneath the ancient oak tree, her knitting needles clicking softly as she observed the gathering with the mild, benevolent expression that had become her hallmark. Her pale blue eyes, however, missed nothing, not the way young Timothy Hartwell kept glancing toward the French windows of the cottage, nor the tension in Mrs. Endicott's shoulders as she poured tea with mechanical precision. "More cucumber sandwiches, Miss Marple?" asked Mrs. Hartwell, sweeping past with a silver platter held aloft like a trophy. She was a handsome woman in her late 50s, with carefully maintained auburn hair and a manner that suggested she had once moved in circles far grander than St. Mary Mead could offer. "How very kind." "Dear," Miss Marple replied, selecting the smallest sandwich with practiced grace. "Such a lovely party. You've outdone yourself." Mrs. Hartwell beamed, though Miss Marple detected a certain brittleness in her smile. "One tries to maintain standards, even in these modern times. My late husband always said that civilization begins with proper entertaining." The late Colonel Hartwell had been dead for 3 years, Miss Marple recalled, though his widow spoke of him as though he had merely stepped out for cigars. The cottage itself had been his retirement dreamer, charming 17th century structure with low ceilings, uneven floors, and a garden that required constant attention. Mrs. Hartwell had transformed it into something approaching a small estate through sheer force of will and, it was whispered, a considerable insurance settlement. "Mother, really, must you hover so?" The voice belonged to Timothy Hartwell, who had materialized at his mother's elbow with the sullen grace of a 25-year-old forced into social obligations. He was tall and fair, with the kind of classical features that might have graced a medieval tapestry, and an air of perpetual dissatisfaction. "I am not hovering, Timothy. I am being a good hostess." Mrs. Hartwell's voice carried a steel edge that made several nearby guests glance over with poorly concealed interest. Timothy rolled his eyes, a gesture his mother pretended not to notice, and wandered toward the rose arbor where Miss Penelope Graves stood examining a bloom with apparent fascination. Miss Marple observed that Penelope's interest increased considerably when Timothy approached, though she affected surprise at his arrival. "Young love," murmured Mrs. Endicott, settling into the chair beside Miss Marple with a soft sigh. She was a widow of long standing, perhaps 60, with grey hair pulled into a severe bun, and eyes that held a lifetime of quiet disappointments, or what passes for it these days. "You don't approve of Miss Graves?" Miss Marple inquired gently, her needles never pausing in their steady rhythm. "Oh, I'm sure she's perfectly nice. A secretary at the solicitor's office in Much Benham, I believe. But Mrs. Hartwell has rather grander plans for Timothy." Mrs. Endicott leaned closer, dropping her voice. "I've heard she's been corresponding with Lady Ashford about her niece, though nothing's been said officially." Before Miss Marple could respond, a burst of laughter erupted from the French windows. Major Denton emerged, red-faced and jovial, with Mrs. Flora Whittington clinging to his arm. The Major was a fixture of village life, perpetually cheerful, fond of his whiskey, and inclined to tell the same stories about his service in India with increasing embellishment. Mrs. Whittington, a plump widow with a taste for bright colors and excessive jewelry, seemed delighted to have captured his attention. Marvelous spread, Mrs. Hartwell. Absolutely the Major boomed, waving his glass in a gesture that threatened nearby guests. Reminds me of the parties we used to throw in Calcutta. Now there was entertaining. Why, I remember once when the Viceroy himself, how fascinating, Major, Mrs. Hartwell interrupted smoothly. Do help yourself to more refreshments. The afternoon wore on with the pleasant tedium of such gatherings. Miss Marple noted how the rector, Mr. Clement, spent most of his time in earnest conversation with young Dr. Haydock, who had recently taken over the village practice. She observed Mrs. Price Ridley's pointed comments about the quality of the sherry. She watched as Mr. Reginald Stern, Mrs. Hartwell's brother, arrived late and was greeted with a coolness that suggested recent discord. Reginald was a contrast to his sister. Where she was polished and precise, he was dishevelled and vague. He taught art at a school in Much Benham and had, according to village gossip, never quite recovered from some unnamed disappointment in his youth. His relationship with his sister had always been strained, though they maintained the fiction of family harmony as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, casting the garden in shades of amber and rose. Mrs. Hartwell clapped her hands for attention. My dear friends, if you'll follow me into the drawing room, I have a small surprise. Timothy has been practicing on the piano, and I've persuaded him to perform for us. There was a general movement toward the cottage, guests gathering their belongings and expressing appropriate enthusiasm. Miss Marple rose slowly, tucking her knitting into its bag, and followed the crowd through the French windows. The drawing room was elegant but crowded, filled with antique furniture that Mrs. Hartwell had collected with the determination of a general planning a campaign. The grand piano dominated one corner, its polished surface reflecting the light from the crystal chandelier. Timothy seated himself at the instrument with visible reluctance, his fingers touching the keys as though testing their temperature. Miss Marple found herself near the doorway, positioned where she could observe both the pianist and the assembled guests. She noticed Penelope Graves watching Timothy with undisguised admiration. She saw Mrs. Hartwell's proud, almost proprietary expression. She registered the way Reginald Stern stood apart from the others, a glass in his hand and a distant look in his eyes. Timothy began to play. Miss Marple recognized, executed with technical proficiency but little emotional depth. The guests listened with polite attention, some genuinely appreciative, others clearly counting the minutes until they could decently leave, and then, quite suddenly, the music stopped. Timothy's hands froze above the keys. His face went white. He turned slowly in his seat, staring not at the assembled guests, but at something beyond them, something in the doorway that led to the hall. The scream that followed was high and terrible, cutting through the evening air like a blade. It came not from Timothy, but from Mrs. Flora Whittington, who had apparently grown warm and stepped into the hall for air. Miss Marple, despite her years, was one of the first to reach the hallway. What she saw there would remain etched in her memory with perfect clarity: the crumpled figure at the base of the stairs, the unnatural angle of the neck, and the growing pool of crimson spreading across the Persian runner. Mrs. Cecilia Hartwell, hostess extraordinaire and pillar of St. Mary Mead Society, would never host another garden party. Chapter 2. Chaos in Sioinge de Seturitha. Next hour passed in a blur of confusion and barely controlled panic. Dr. Haydock pushed through the crowd, his face grim as he knelt beside the fallen woman. His examination was brief and professional, though Miss Marple noticed the slight tremor in his hands as he closed Mrs. Hartwell's eyes. "She's gone," he announced quietly. "Her neck is broken. The fall." Timothy's voice was hoarse, almost unrecognizable. He stood in the drawing-room doorway, one hand gripping the frame as though it were the only thing keeping him upright. She didn't fall. She couldn't have. Mother never used those stairs. She always complained they were too steep, too dangerous. Major Denton had taken charge in the way that retired military men often do in moments of crisis. Now, my boy. Accidents happen. Terrible thing, terrible. But we must keep our heads. Someone ring the police. And perhaps we should all remain where we are until they arrive. Mrs. Whittington had been led to a chair in the drawing room, where she sat fanning herself and accepting sips of brandy with trembling hands. "I can't bear it," she kept repeating. "I simply can't bear it. To think that just moments ago she was alive, and now, Flora, please," Mrs. Price Ridley said sharply. She was a formidable woman with iron-grey hair and a manner that brooked no nonsense. Hysterics help no one. We must think practically. Where is Mr. Stern? Someone should inform him that his sister, I'm here. Reginald Stern emerged from the shadows near the library door. His face was pale but composed, and he carried his empty glass as though it were a talisman. I heard the screaming. I was in the library, looking for a book Cecilia had promised to lend me. Miss Marple, who had quietly returned to her chair, observed this statement with interest. The library was at the far end of the cottage, well away from the staircase. Yet Reginald had appeared remarkably quickly after the discovery of the body. The rector, Mr. Clement, was speaking in low tones to Timothy, offering what comfort he could. Penelope Graves hovered nearby, her pretty face streaked with tears. Clearly wanting to approach Timothy, but uncertain of her welcome, Mrs. Endicott had taken it upon herself to cover Mrs. Hartwell's body with a tablecloth, performing the task with quiet efficiency. "The police will want to know where everyone was," Major Denton announced, as though this were a military briefing. "When the poor woman fell, I mean. We should all think carefully. I myself was in the drawing room, listening to young Timothy's playing. Capital performance, by the way, under the circumstances. We were all in the drawing room," Mrs. Price Ridley said impatiently. "Except for Flora, who had stepped out. And Mr. Stern, apparently, who was in the library. Though I must say, it seems odd." Reginald's voice was sharp. "What exactly seems odd, Mrs. Price?" "Simply that you were away from the gathering at such a crucial moment. Your sister had organized this party with such care, and yet you chose to absent yourself. I had a headache. The noise, the crowdie needed a moment of quiet. Is that a crime?" Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. She was thinking about the stairs, about Mrs. Hartwell's known aversion to them, about the way Timothy had frozen at the piano. She was also thinking about something else. Something small and perhaps insignificant. But her experience had taught her that insignificant details often proved to be quite the opposite. Inspector Slack arrived 40 minutes after the telephone call, bringing with him the full weight of official authority and a manner that managed to be both brusque and ineffectual. He was a heavy-set man with thinning hair and an unfortunate tendency to jump to conclusions. "Right then," he said, surveying the scene with ill-concealed irritation. "This is what happens when old women go climbing steep stairs. Tragic, certainly, but hardly mysterious. Dr. Haydock, You've examined the body. I have, Inspector. Death was instantaneous, caused by a broken neck consistent with a fall down the stairs. There you have it. Accidental death. Terrible shame, but these things happen. Now, I'll need statements from everyone who was present, but I don't expect this will take long. Inspector, Timothy said, his voice stronger now, though still strained. I must insist that you investigate this properly. My mother would never have used those stairs. She was terrified of them. She always used the main staircase at the front of the house. Inspector Slack's expression suggested he had encountered grieving relatives before and knew how to handle them. Yes, I understand you're upset, Mr. Hartwell, but people do irrational things. Perhaps she was in a hurry. Perhaps she forgot her usual caution. The evidence is clear she fell down the stairs. Unless you're suggesting something else? I'm suggesting that something is wrong. Very wrong, Inspector, Miss Marple said gently. Her voice so soft that several people turned in surprise, having forgotten she was there. Perhaps Mr. Hartwell has a point. Might it be worth examining the circumstances a bit more carefully? After all, Mrs. Hartwell was the hostess of this gathering. It does seem unusual that she would leave her guests to climb a staircase she reportedly feared. Inspector Slack turned to regard Miss Marple with the kind of patronizing patience one might show to a confused child. With respect, Madame, I believe I know how to conduct an investigation. Now, if everyone could please provide their names and addresses to my sergeant. We can wrap this up efficiently. The guests complied with varying degrees of cooperation. Mrs. Whittington, still tearful, provided a rambling account of her discovery of the body. Major Denton offered his observations with military precision. Mrs. Price Ridley made it clear she had seen nothing unusual, while Mrs. Endicott quietly confirmed she had been in the drawing room throughout the performance. Penelope Graves, her voice barely above a whisper, explained that she had been standing near the back of the drawing room, where she could watch Timothy play. Mr. Clement verified that he had been engaged in conversation with Dr. Haydock near the fireplace. Reginald Stern repeated his account of being in the library, and no one could contradict him. Miss Marple provided her own statement with characteristic modesty, mentioning only that she had been seated near the doorway and had heard the scream. She did not mention what she had noticed about the carpet runner, or the peculiar position of Mrs. Hartwell's shoes, or the faint scent of lavender that seemed out of place. These were merely observations, after all, and Inspector Slack clearly had no interest in observations from elderly ladies who knitted dot, as the guests were finally permitted to leave. Timothy stood alone in the hallway, staring at the spot where his mother had died. The tablecloth had been removed when the body was taken away, but the stain remained, a dark accusation against the elegant carpet. I know she didn't fall, he said to no one in particular. I know it. Miss Marple paused on her way out, resting a gentle hand on his arm. Then we must find out what really happened, mustn't we? But these things take time and patience. An observation. Timothy looked at her with sudden hope. Will you help? Everyone says you're remarkably clever at sorting out these sorts of puzzles. I merely observe human nature, my dear. But yes, I shall certainly take an interest. Now, you should rest. Tomorrow will bring fresh perspectives. As Miss Marple walked slowly home through the gathering twilight, her mind was already sifting through the events of the evening, arranging them like pieces of a puzzle that had not yet revealed its pattern. She thought about Mrs. Hartwell's character, about the relationships within that house, about the small details that others had overlooked. Somewhere in the chaos of that terrible evening, she suspected, was a truth that would prove far more disturbing than a simple accident. Chapter 3. Whispers and a River Lationess. The village of St. Mary Mead had not experienced such excitement in years. By the following morning, Mrs. Hartwell's death had been dissected, analyzed, and embroidered upon in every shop, garden, and drawing room within a 5-mile radius. Miss Marple, making her customary rounds, listened with the air of someone merely passing time in pleasant conversation. At the fishmonger's, she learned from Mrs. Dane that Mrs. Hartwell had been seen arguing with her brother just 2 days before the party. At the greengrocer's, young Betty informed her that Timothy had been spotted in Much Benham with Penelope Graves on several occasions, looking very romantic-like at the post office. Miss Hartnell mentioned that Mrs. Hartwell had recently changed her will, though how she knew this was left diplomatically unasked. Changed her will, you say? Miss Marple murmured, selecting stamps with careful deliberation. How very interesting. Well, I shouldn't gossip, Miss Hartnell said, in the tone of someone who fully intended to do exactly that. But my cousin works at Galbraith and Stevens, in Much Benham the solicitors. You know, and she happened to mention that Mrs. Hartwell had been in just last week, making alterations to her will, apparently. Very particular about it, too. Miss Marple filed this information away as she continued her rounds. At the rectory, she found Mr. Clement in his study, looking troubled. Ah, Miss Marple, I was hoping you might call. This business with Mrs. Hartwell has left me quite distressed. Inspector Slack seems convinced it was an accident, but young Timothy is beside himself. He keeps insisting his mother was murdered. And what do you think, Mr. Clement? The rector sighed, removing his spectacles to polish them with his handkerchief. I think grief can make people see conspiracies where none exist. And yet, I must admit, there was something rather odd about the whole evening. Mrs. Hartwell was in such high spirits before the gathering. She seemed almost triumphant about something. Triumphant? How interesting. Did she say what pleased her so? Not directly, but I overheard her speaking to her brother before he arrived late, you understand. She was on the telephone in the study. I was passing by and couldn't help but hear. She said something about how he would finally have to face facts, that she'd made certain arrangements, and that it was time for everyone to understand their proper place. Miss Marple nodded slowly. She sounds as though she were making preparations, perhaps for an announcement. That was my impression, though what announcement, I couldn't say. Miss Marple's next visit was to Dr. Haydock, whom she found in his surgery reviewing notes. He greeted her with the mixture of respect and amusement that most people felt toward St. Mary Mead's most famous resident. Come to pick my brain about the post-mortem, have you? He asked with a smile. I'm afraid there's not much to tell. Death was caused by a broken neck, consistent with a fall. There were no other injuries, no signs of struggle, no indication of foul play. What about the angle of the fall? Miss Marple asked. Could you tell if she had been pushed? Dr. Haydock shook his head. Impossible to say with certainty. The injuries would look the same whether she fell or was pushed. There were no defensive wounds, no bruising to suggest she'd been grabbed or shoved. If it was murder, it was executed very cleanly, and the time of death, between 7:15 and 7:30 in the evening. Timothy had just begun playing the piano at 7:12. Checked my watch, as I had another appointment afterward. The scream came perhaps 10 or 15 minutes later. Miss Marple thanked him and made her way to Bramble Cottage, where she found Timothy sitting in the library, surrounded by papers and photographs. He looked as though he hadn't slept. "Miss Marple," he said, rising quickly. "Thank goodness. I've been going through Mother's things, trying to find something, anything that might explain what happened. And have you found anything?" Timothy gestured helplessly at the papers. Letters, bills, social correspondence. Nothing that seemed significant, except he picked up a leather-bound diary. This was locked in her desk drawer. I had to force the lock. "I'm afraid. Perhaps you should let me see it," Miss Marple suggested gently. The diary was revealing in its way. Mrs. Hartwell had kept meticulous records of her social engagements, her expenses, and her opinions of her neighbors. But it was the entries from the past month that caught Miss Marple's attention. September 2nd confronted R about the money again. "He continues to deny everything, but I know what I saw. Time to take action." September 10th spoke with Galbraith about the will. "All arranged as I wished. R will be most displeased, but he's brought this on himself." September 18th, Timothy still sees that Graves' girl, despite my wishes, must make my position clear at the party. Lady Ashford's niece arrives next week, a far more suitable match. September 25th, everything is in place. The party will be the perfect occasion to make my announcements. R will attend whether he likes it or not. R is obviously your Uncle Reginald, Miss Marple observed. It appears there was some dispute about money. Timothy nodded bitterly. Uncle Reginald was always borrowing from Mother. She controlled the family money. You seem my grandfather's estate. Uncle Reginald received an allowance, but it was never enough for him. He's rather hopeless with finances, and these announcements she intended to make. Timothy's jaw tightened. About Penelope, I expect. Mother never approved. Penelope is wonderful, kind, intelligent, hard-working, but she's not titled or wealthy, so Mother considered her beneath us. It's ridiculous snobbery, but Mother could never see past social position. Miss Marple considered this carefully. Did your uncle know about the changes to the will? I don't see how he could have. Mother was very secretive about her financial affairs. Perhaps, Miss Marple said softly, we should have a conversation with Mr. Stern. They found Reginald Stern in his cottage at the edge of the village. A small, untidy place that smelled of turpentine and neglect. He was working on a painting when they arrived, and seemed unsurprised to see them. I wondered when someone would come asking questions, he said, not looking up from his canvas. Inspector Slack was remarkably uninterested in anything I had to say. But you, Miss Marple, you're different. You actually pay attention. Mr. Stern, I wonder if you might tell us about your relationship with your sister. Reginald set down his brush and turned to face them. His expression was weary rather than defensive. We didn't get along. Haven't for years. Cecilia was always the favored child, the successful one. She married well, moved in society, did everything our parents wanted. I was the disappointment, the artistic dreamer who never amounted to anything. And the money? Miss Marple asked gently. Reginald laughed without humor. Ah, yes. The money. Our father left everything in trust, with Cecilia as the primary beneficiary and me receiving an allowance at her discretion. It was meant to encourage me to make something of myself, I suppose. Instead, it just made me dependent on my sister's charity. You quarreled about it recently. We quarreled about it constantly. I needed more. My expenses, my students, my work kit, all costs money. But Cecilia believed I was wasting what she gave me. She wanted me to give up teaching, give up painting, get what she called a proper job, as if teaching wasn't proper enough. Did you know she had changed her will? Reginald's face went pale. Changed it? How? That's what we're trying to discover, Timothy said coldly. Perhaps she was planning to cut you off entirely. If she did, then her death benefits you considerably, Reginald shot back. You inherit everything now, don't you? The house, the money, the freedom to marry your little secretary without mother's interference. The two men faced each other with barely concealed hostility. Miss Marple intervened before the situation could escalate. Gentlemen, please. We're all seeking the truth here. Mr. Stern, I must ask, where exactly were you when Mrs. Hartwell died? I told the inspector. I was in the library. Yes, but the library is quite far from the drawing room. What took you there? Reginald hesitated, then sighed. Very well. The truth is, I was avoiding the party. Cecilia had made it clear she was going to announce something that evening. Something that would, in her words, clarify everyone's position. I suspected she meant to humiliate me in front of half the village. So I went to the library to fortify myself with brandy before facing whatever she had planned. Did anyone see you there? No. That was rather the point. Miss Marple nodded slowly. And you heard nothing unusual? No sounds from the back stairs. The back stairs are well away from the library. I heard music, the general murmur of conversation, then screaming. By the time I reached the hall, everyone was already gathered around. He stopped, swallowing hard. Around Cecilia's body. As they left Reginald's cottage, Timothy turned to Miss Marple with frustration evident in every line of his face. He had motive and opportunity. He could easily have slipped out of the library, pushed Mother down the stairs, and returned without anyone noticing. He could have, Miss Marple agreed, but so could several other people. The question we must ask ourselves is not simply who could have done it, but who would have done it and why at that particular moment. What do you mean? Miss Marple smiled gently. Your mother was planning to make announcements at the party. What if someone wanted to prevent those announcements? What if the murder wasn't about what had happened, but about what? Chapter 4. The Will and the WAY. Mr. Galbraith of Galbraith and Stevens was a thin, precise man who received Miss Marple and Timothy in his oak-panelled office with the cautious courtesy of someone who dealt in other people's secrets. He had, he explained, been expecting them. Mrs. Hartwell's death is most tragic, he said, folding his hands on the leather blotter before him. She was a client of long standing. I must confess I am not entirely comfortable discussing her affairs, even with her son, without proper legal authorization. Surely, under the circumstances, Timothy began. But Mr. Galbraith held up a hand. However, given that you are the primary beneficiary, Mr. Hartwell, and that there may be questions about the estate, I believe I can share certain relevant information. Your mother did indeed change her will last week. The previous will left the bulk of her estate to you, with provisions for your uncle Reginald. The new will maintains you as primary beneficiary, but there were significant changes. What sort of changes? Mr. Galbraith adjusted his spectacles. The allowance for Mr. Reginald Stern was to be discontinued entirely. Instead, he was to receive a single lump sum of £10,000, payable immediately, with no further claims on the estate. Additionally, there were new conditional clauses regarding your inheritance. Timothy frowned. Conditional? What conditions? Your mother specified that should you marry without her approval within 5 years of her death, your inheritance would be held in trust until you reached the age of 40, with only a modest allowance available to you in the interim. Upon her death, the approval would be granted or withheld by trustees myself and Major Denton based on what we determined to be a suitable match. Timothy's face flushed with anger. She was trying to control me even from beyond the grave. She was trying to protect the family legacy, Mr. Galbraith said mildly, though I did counsel her that such provisions are often problematic. Miss Marple, who had been listening with keen interest, now spoke. Mr. Galbraith, did anyone else know about these changes? Not from me. Client confidentiality is sacrosanct. However, Mrs. Hartwell mentioned that she intended to inform the relevant parties at her garden party. She said she wanted to make it clear what everyone stood to gain or lose by their behavior. So she meant to announce publicly that Reginald was being cut off, and that Timothy's inheritance was conditional on marrying someone she approved of. That was my understanding, yes. As they left the solicitor's office, Timothy was silent, his face stormy. Miss Marple let him walk for several minutes before speaking. You must see what this means, she said gently. That my mother was a manipulative tyrant. Yes, I see that perfectly well. That several people had strong motives to prevent those announcements from being made. Your uncle would have been publicly humiliated and cut off from future support. You would have learned that your freedom to marry as you chose was to be taken away. Timothy stopped walking. You think I killed my own mother? I think the police might consider it a possibility. You were in the drawing room, yes, but you were also at the piano, with your back to the door. You could have excused yourself briefly, committed the act, and returned before anyone noticed your absence. But I didn't. I was playing the entire time. Were you? Or did you pause? Did you make a mistake? Stop to collect yourself? In the confusion of the moment, would anyone remember exactly? Timothy's face had gone white. This is absurd. I loved my mother, despite her faults. I would never have hurt her. I believe you, Miss Marple said softly. But we must consider all possibilities if we're to discover who did hurt her. Tell me, what did you think of Major Denton? The change of subject caught Timothy off guard. Major Denton. He's a bore, mostly. Tells the same stories endlessly. Why? He was named as one of the trustees in your mother's new will. Did you know that? No. Mother never mentioned it. Did they know each other well? Timothy considered this. I suppose so. He was often at the house. Mother said he was a useful person to know good connections, respected in the village. But I always thought she found him rather tedious. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. They had reached the tea shop, and she suggested they stop for refreshment. Over tea and scones, she steered the conversation toward the other guests at the party. Tell me about Miss Graves. How did you meet her? Timothy's expression softened immediately. At the solicitor's office, actually. I was there with Mother about some property matter, and Penelope was working at the desk. She was so kind, so different from the women Mother usually pushed at me. We started talking, and then meeting for coffee. It's been about 6 months now, and your mother disapproved. Violently. She said Penelope was trying to trap me, that she was after the family money. It wasn't true. Penelope didn't even know about the money at first. She just liked me for myself. Mother couldn't understand that. How did Miss Graves react to your mother's opposition? She was hurt, of course, but she's not the sort to make a scene. She said we should wait, let mother come round. Penelope is very patient, very understanding. Everything mother claimed she wanted in a daughter-in-law, but because Penelope works for a living, mother considered her beneath us. Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. And if your mother had made her announcement at the party, revealing the conditions of the will? Timothy set down his cup with a sharp clink. It would have been humiliating. For both of us. Penelope was at the party, she would have heard everything. The implication that she wasn't good enough, that our marriage would cost me my inheritance. I don't know if we could have survived that kind of public humiliation. So Miss Graves also had a motive to prevent the announcement. You can't seriously suspect Penelope. She's the gentlest person I know. She couldn't hurt anyone. Perhaps not directly, Miss Marple murmured. But there are many ways to hurt someone, and not all of them require violence. That evening, Miss Marple sat in her cottage, her knitting untouched in her lap, as she reviewed everything she had learned. On a sheet of paper, she had written down the key facts. Mrs. Hartwell changed her will 1 week before her death. She planned to announce the changes at the party. Reginald Stern was to be cut off entirely. Timothy's inheritance was to be conditional on an approved marriage. Major Denton was named as a trustee. Mrs. Hartwell feared the back stairs and never used them. The murder occurred during Timothy's piano performance. Several people had left the drawing room or were in positions where they could not be fully accounted for. She thought about human nature, about pride and desperation, about love and money. She thought about the small details she had observed at the party, details that had seemed insignificant at the time but now began to form a pattern. There was something about the timing that bothered her. Why during the piano performance? Why at that exact moment? And there was something about Mrs. Hartwell's shoes that had caught her attention, though she couldn't quite put her finger on why. Miss Marple set down her paper and picked up her knitting. Sometimes, she found, the best way to solve a puzzle was to let one's mind wander, while one's hands worked automatically. The rhythm of the needles, the familiar pattern of the stitches, often allowed solutions to emerge from the depths of her subconscious as she knitted. She thought about a case many years ago in St. Mary Mead, when a woman had fallen downstairs and everyone had assumed it was an accident. But Miss Marple had noticed that the woman's shoes were on the wrong feet, and that small detail had unraveled a carefully constructed murder. Shoes. Mrs. Hartwell's shoes. Miss Marple set down her knitting with sudden decision. Tomorrow, she would need to visit Bramble Cottage again. There was something she needed to verify. Something that had been nagging at the edges of her consciousness since that terrible evening. Chapter 5. A Hidden Seal. Yeath. Morning dawned grey and drizzly. The kind of weather that matched the sombre mood that had settled over St. Mary Mead. Marple made her way to Bramble Cottage with her umbrella and a basket containing a casserole, the sort of offering that provided the perfect excuse for calling on the bereaved. Timothy answered the door himself, looking haggard. Miss Marple, how kind of you. Please, come in. I'm afraid the house is rather a mess. I've been going through Mother's things, and I'm not very good at domestic arrangements. Perfectly understandable, dear. I've brought you something for your supper. Now, I wonder if you might indulge an old woman's curiosity. Would it be possible for me to see the back stairs again? There's something about them that's been troubling me. Timothy led her through the cottage to the narrow staircase where his mother had died. The carpet runner had been cleaned, though a faint discoloration remained. Miss Marple stood at the bottom, looking up the steep flight of steps. "Your mother was found at the bottom, facing this way?" she asked. "Yes, on her back, with her head." Timothy's voice broke slightly. "With her head at an angle." Miss Marple nodded, then turned her attention to the stairs themselves. She began to climb slowly, testing each step, running her hand along the banister. Timothy watched with puzzled concern. "Miss Marple, are you quite all right? Those stairs are rather steep." "Perfectly all right, dear. I'm simply trying to understand something." She reached the top, landing, and looked down. Now, if someone were to fall from here, they would naturally tumble forward, wouldn't they? Rolling down the stairs, accumulating momentum. "I suppose so." "Why, but your mother was found on her back." "That suggests she was facing the top of the stairs when she fell, which means she was either coming down backward, most unlikely, or she was pushed while facing her attacker." Timothy's eyes widened. "Then it was murder." "You're certain now?" "I'm rarely certain of anything until all the pieces fit together, but I am beginning to form a theory." "Tell me, where are your mother's shoes, the ones she was wearing that evening?" "I believe they're still in her room." The police looked at them but found nothing suspicious. Mrs. Hartwell's bedroom was exactly as one might expect, orderly and expensive. Everything had its place, from the silver-backed brushes on the dressing table to the neat row of shoes in the wardrobe. Timothy retrieved the pair she had worn to the party, black patent leather pumps with modest heels. Miss Marple examined them carefully, turning them over in her hands. She ran her fingers over the soles, paying particular attention to the heels. Then she smiled, that small, satisfied smile of someone who has just confirmed a suspicion. "Most interesting," she murmured. "Timothy, did your mother suffer from any problems with her feet?" "Not that I know of." "Why do you ask?" "Because these shoes show very uneven wear. The left heel is considerably more worn than the right, and there's a scuff mark on the left toe that suggests she dragged that foot slightly when she walked. Yet I observed your mother at the party, and I noticed no limp or hesitation in her gait. I don't understand what you're getting at." "Neither do I, completely. But I suspect it will prove significant. Now, might I see your mother's other shoes?" They examined the entire collection. Every pair showed the same pattern: excessive wear on the left side, minimal wear on the right. Yet Mrs. Hartwell had walked perfectly normally at the party. Perhaps she had multiple pairs and wore different ones at different times. Timothy suggested. "Perhaps. Or perhaps these shoes tell us something else entirely." Miss Marple tucked this information away in her mind. "Now, I wonder if we might examine your mother's correspondence. I know the police looked through it, but they may not have known what to look for. In Mrs. Hartwell's study, they found filing cabinets filled with meticulously organized papers. Miss Marple worked through them systematically, reading letters, examining bills, noting the details that others might have overlooked. Timothy watched, increasingly frustrated. "I don't see how any of this helps. Bills from dressmakers, letters from friends, social invitations, there's nothing unusual here." "On the contrary," Miss Marple said softly, "there's something very unusual indeed. Your mother received a letter from a London solicitor 3 weeks ago. It's here, filed under legal matters. Do you know what this refers to?" She handed Timothy the letter. He read it quickly, his frown deepening. "It's about some property in London that Mother apparently owned." "I didn't know anything about it. The solicitor is asking about her intentions regarding the lease, which was coming up for renewal. And this response, filed just behind it. Timothy read the carbon copy of his mother's reply. She says she's decided to sell the property rather than renew the lease. She mentions that she needs the capital for arrangements I am making for family security. What does that mean? I believe, Miss Marple said carefully, that your mother was preparing for something. She was consolidating her assets, making changes to her will, and planning announcements. It's almost as though she knew she was in danger. But from whom? That, my dear, is what we must discover. Now, there's one more person I think we should speak with, Mrs. Flora Whittington. They found Mrs. Whittington at home, still apparently suffering from the shock of discovering the body. She received them in her cluttered parlor, surrounded by too much furniture and too many decorative knickknacks. Oh, Miss Marple, Mr. Hartwell, how kind of you to call. I've been quite beside myself. I keep seeing poor Mrs. Hartwell lying there, and I can't sleep. I can't eat. Dr. Haydock has given me something for my nerves, but it doesn't help much. I'm sure it's been terribly distressing, Miss Marple said sympathetically. But I wonder if you might help us understand exactly what happened. You discovered the body, didn't you? Yes, and I wish I hadn't. I'd gone into the hall because I was feeling rather warm. The drawing room was so crowded, and I thought I might step outside for some air. That's when I saw her, lying at the bottom of the stairs. I knew at once she was dead. One can always tell, can't one? The way the body looks, so empty and still. And you screamed. I couldn't help myself. It was such a shock. Everyone came running, and then there was such confusion. Poor Dr. Haydock, trying to help, though of course it was too late. Mrs. Whittington, Miss Marple said gently, when you stepped into the hall, did you see anyone else? Anyone near the stairs, or leaving the area? Mrs. Whittington's brow furrowed. I don't think so, though I wasn't really looking, you understand. I was focused on getting some air. Wait, there might have been someone. Just a glimpse of movement near the library door. But it was so quick, and then I saw Mrs. Hartwell, and everything else went out of my mind. A glimpse of movement. Can you describe it? Was it a man or a woman? I couldn't say. Truly, I couldn't. It was just a shadow, really, or perhaps I imagined it. One's mind plays tricks in moments of stress. After they left Mrs. Whittington's house, Timothy turned to Miss Marple with excitement. She saw someone. Near the library door, that's where Uncle Reginald claimed to be. He must have been coming from the stairs, returning to the library after pushing Mother. Perhaps, Miss Marple said, or perhaps the shadow she saw was someone going to the library, not coming from it. Or perhaps it was someone else entirely. We mustn't jump to conclusions. Then what do? We continue to observe and to ask questions. I think it's time we spoke with Miss Penelope Graves. They found Penelope at the solicitor's office in Much Benham during her lunch hour. She agreed to walk with them in the small park across the street, her pretty face anxious and drawn. I've been so worried about Timothy, she said, taking his hand. This has been horrible for you. I wanted to come to the house, but I wasn't sure if I'd be welcome. Your mother never liked me, and I didn't want to intrude on your grief. You could never intrude, Timothy said warmly. You're the only bright spot in all of this darkness. Miss Marple observed the young couple with interest. Penelope Graves was indeed pretty, with soft brown hair and gentle eyes that held genuine affection when she looked at Timothy. She seemed sincere in her concern, but Miss Marple had learned long ago that sincerity could be feigned by those with sufficient motivation. Miss Graves, she said, I wonder if you might tell me about the evening of the party. You were in the drawing room during Timothy's performance. Yes, standing near the back. I wanted to hear him play, but I also knew Mrs. Hartwell wouldn't want me to prominently placed. She'd made it clear I was only invited out of courtesy to Timothy. And you saw nothing unusual? Heard nothing? Penelope hesitated. I'm not sure if it's significant, but I did notice Mrs. Hartwell seemed agitated during the afternoon. Before we went inside for the performance, I saw her speaking with Major Denton near the French windows. They seemed to be having a rather intense conversation. Mrs. Hartwell looked upset, and the Major was trying to calm her down. Did you hear what they were discussing? Only fragments. Something about making sure and too late to back out now. Mrs. Hartwell said something like, "They'll all know the truth by evening's end." And the Major said, "Are you quite certain this is wise?" But then they noticed me approaching and changed the subject. Timothy frowned. Why would Mother be confiding in Major Denton? Perhaps because he was to be one of your trustees, Miss Marple suggested. She may have been informing him of his new responsibilities, or perhaps they were discussing something else entirely. After parting from Penelope, Miss Marple insisted on calling upon Major Denton. They found him at his cottage, a neat bachelor establishment filled with military memorabilia and faded photographs of his service years. Miss Marple, young Hartwell, come in, come in. Terrible business, all this. Still can't quite believe it. Mrs. Hartwell was a fine woman, very fine indeed. Knew how to run things properly, not like some of these modern types. Major, Miss Marple said. Once they were settled with tea, I understand Mrs. Hartwell had named you as a trustee in her new will. The Major's jovial expression faltered slightly. Yes, yes, she mentioned something about it. Asked if I'd be willing to serve. Duty and all that one doesn't refuse such requests. Though I must say, I wasn't entirely comfortable with the whole arrangement. Why not? Well, putting conditions on a young man's inheritance based on whom he marries seems a bit heavy-handed, doesn't it? Not that I said as much to Mrs. Hartwell. She was quite determined. Said it was essential for preserving the family's position. Did she tell you whom she hoped Timothy would marry? Lady Ashford's niece. Nice gel, by all accounts. Good family, proper upbringing. Mrs. Hartwell was quite keen on making the match. She'd invited the girl to visit next week. Planned to introduce her to Timothy at a dinner party. All very calculated, I'm afraid. Timothy's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Major Denton, Miss Marple continued. Miss Graves mentioned that you and Mrs. Hartwell were having a conversation just before the performance. What were you discussing? The Major shifted uncomfortably. Oh, just the usual chit-chat. Nothing of consequence. She seemed upset. Was she having second thoughts about her plans? The Major was silent for a long moment, his fingers drumming on the arm of his chair. Finally, he sighed. Very well. I suppose it will all come out eventually. Mrs. Hartwell had received a letter that afternoon delivered by hand, apparently during the party. She showed it to me because she was uncertain how to respond. It was rather unpleasant. What did it say? It said that if she went ahead with her planned announcements, certain information about her past would be made public. Information that would, as the letter put it, destroy her carefully constructed reputation. Timothy stared. Someone was blackmailing my mother. It appeared so, though the letter didn't explicitly demand money, just silence. Mrs. Hartwell was furious. She said she wouldn't be intimidated, that she'd worked too hard to let anyone threaten her now. I tried to counsel caution, suggested she might postpone her announcements until the matter could be investigated. But she was adamant. She said, and I quote, "Let them do their worst. I've faced worse than this and survived." What information was the letter referring to? Miss Marple asked. She wouldn't say. She just crushed the letter in her hand and threw it in the fire. Said it was lies and slander, nothing that could actually harm her. But I could see she was shaken, despite her brave words. And you have no idea who sent it? None. The letter wasn't signed. As they left the Major's cottage, Miss Marple was deep in thought. The case was becoming more complex with each new revelation. Mrs. Hartwell had been facing multiple pressures: the need to control her family's future, the threat of blackmail, the resistance of those around her to her plans. Any one of these might have provided a motive for murder, but which one had actually triggered the fatal act? And who, among all the people at that party, had both the motive and the opportunity to push Cecilia Hartwell down those stairs? Miss Marple was beginning to see the shape of the truth, but there were still pieces missing. And she knew from experience that in matters of murder, it was often the smallest, most overlooked detail that proved to be the key to everything. Chapter 6. Confrontations and SECRITs that evening. Miss Marple invited several key individuals to tea at her cottage. An informal gathering that she presented as a memorial for Mrs. Hartwell, but which she intended as something quite different. Timothy came, of course, and Penelope Graves. Reginald Stern arrived, looking wary. Mrs. Endicott accepted the invitation with her usual quiet efficiency. And somewhat to Miss Marple's surprise, Mrs. Price Ridley announced that she too would attend, as she had relevant information to share. Miss Marple served tea with her customary grace, chatting pleasantly about village matters until everyone had settled. Then, with a gentleness that belied her purpose, she turned the conversation to the late Mrs. Hartwell. "I've been thinking a great deal about Cecilia," she said softly. "She was a remarkable woman in many ways. So determined, so focused on maintaining her family's position. It must have been difficult for her, being widowed at a relatively young age, taking on the responsibility of managing the estate alone. She thrived on it," Reginald said bitterly. Control was Cecilia's favorite pastime. And yet, Miss Marple continued, there were aspects of her life that remained mysterious. "For instance, Mrs. Price Ridley, you mentioned you had relevant information." Mrs. Price Ridley set down her teacup with a decisive clink. "I've been debating whether to speak up, but in the interests of truth, I believe I must." Mrs. Hartwell was not who she claimed to be. The room fell silent. Timothy stared at Mrs. Price Ridley in disbelief. "What are you talking about?" "I mean that your mother's background was not as illustrious as she led everyone to believe. I have a cousin who lives in Yorkshire, where Mrs. Hartwell, should I say, Miss Cecilia Perkins grew up. She was the daughter of a shopkeeper, not a gentleman. She changed her name and fabricated a family history when she married your father." Reginald gave a harsh laugh. "So the great secret comes out at last." "Yes, it's true. Cecilia was born plain Cecilia Perkins, daughter of a grocer. She was clever and beautiful, and she used both to climb as high as she could. Our father, my father, I should say. We shared a mother, but had different fathers. Married her when he was already quite old. Cecilia had been his housekeeper, and she made herself indispensable. You knew about this?" Timothy demanded. Of course I knew. It's why Cecilia kept me on an allowance rather than giving me a lump sum. She was afraid I'd tell people the truth about her origins. She needn't have worried. I had no desire to expose her. What good would it have done me? But someone else knew, Miss Marple said quietly. Someone who sent her a blackmail letter threatening to reveal her past. Mrs. Endicott's cup rattled in its saucer. A blackmail letter. When? The day of the party. It was delivered during the garden party, before the performance. Major Denton told me about it. Mrs. Hartwell showed him the letter and then destroyed it. Who would do such a thing? Penelope asked. Miss Marple looked around the room, her mild eyes taking in each face. Someone who wanted to stop Mrs. Hartwell from making her announcements. Someone who had discovered her secret and thought it could be used as leverage. But Mrs. Hartwell refused to be intimidated. She destroyed the letter and declared her intention to proceed with her plans regardless. So someone killed her instead, Timothy said hollowly. Someone in this room, perhaps. Oh, I don't think the murderer is in this room, Miss Marple said. At least, not directly. Everyone looked at her in confusion. You see, she continued, I've been thinking about the peculiar circumstances of Mrs. Hartwell's death. She was found at the bottom of the back stairs, stairs she was known to fear and avoid. She was on her back, suggesting she'd been pushed while facing her attacker. And there's the matter of her shoes. Her shoes. Reginald echoed. What about them? They showed very uneven where the left side considerably more worn than the right. Yet Mrs. Hartwell walked without any noticeable limp or impediment. I found that curious, so I made some inquiries. It turns out that Mrs. Hartwell had been consulting a specialist in London for a problem with her left knee, an old injury that caused her pain when climbing stairs. She managed it quite well on level ground, but stairs were difficult for her, which is why she avoided the back stairs, Timothy said. They're so steep, exactly. So what would have induced her to use them that evening? What would have been important enough to overcome her fear and her pain? The room was silent. Then Mrs. Endicott spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. She must have been lured there. Someone must have asked her to meet them, or told her something that required her to go upstairs immediately. Precisely. Mrs. Endicott. And that someone must have been a person Mrs. Hartwell trusted, or at least someone whose request she felt she couldn't ignore. Now, who among the guests that evening could have sent her such a message? Anyone, Reginald said. A servant could have delivered a note, or someone could have spoken to her privately. True, but the timing is significant. The murder occurred during Timothy's piano performance, the performance that Mrs. Hartwell herself had arranged. She was proud of Timothy's playing and wanted her guests to hear him. Would she have willingly left during his performance unless the matter was urgent? No, Timothy said slowly. She wouldn't have. She'd been planning that performance for weeks. Nothing short of an emergency would have made her leave. Miss Marple nodded. So we must ask ourselves, what kind of emergency could have arisen at that exact moment? And I believe I know the answer. Mrs. Endicott, you've been very quiet throughout this investigation. Would you like to tell us why? Mrs. Endicott's face had gone pale. Her hands trembled as she set down her teacup. I don't know what you mean. I think you do. You see, I noticed something about you at the party. You were pouring tea with great precision, but your hands were shaking not with age or infirmity, but with nerves. You were watching Mrs. Hartwell constantly, and when she announced a piano performance, you looked almost relieved. Why was that, I wonder? I don't. Mrs. Endicott, Miss Marple said gently but firmly. You were Mrs. Hartwell's housekeeper many years ago, weren't you? Before she married Colonel Hartwell. Before she became the grand lady of society. Mrs. Endicott closed her eyes. When she spoke, her voice was barely audible. Yes, I worked for Mr. Stern Reginald's father. Cecilia and I were both in service there. We became friends, or so I thought. And you knew about her background. Of course I knew. We came from the same village in Yorkshire. We'd grown up together, Cecilia Perkins and Eleanor Watkins. When her mother died and her father fell on hard times, Cecilia came to work at the Stern house. She was ambitious, even then. She made no secret of wanting to better herself, but you said nothing when she reinvented herself as a lady of breeding. Mrs. Endicott's eyes blazed. Why should I have? She'd earned her position through her own efforts. Mr. Stern loved her. He didn't care about her background. It was only after his death that she started putting on airs, pretending she'd always been gentry. But I still kept her secret. We'd been friends once, and I'm not one to betray confidences. Until recently, Miss Marple said. Something changed, didn't it? Something made you angry enough to send that blackmail letter. Mrs. Endicott's face crumpled. It wasn't blackmail. I never wanted money from her. I just wanted her to stop being so cruel to everyone around her. She was planning to cut off Reginald, completely Reginald, who was Mr. Stern's own son. She was going to control Timothy's life, force him to marry someone he didn't love, just to satisfy her own ambitions. I couldn't stand by and watch her destroy everyone for the sake of her pride. So you sent the letter, hoping to frighten her into reconsidering her plans. Yes, but it didn't work. She just became more determined. She told me. Mrs. Endicott stopped abruptly, her hand flying to her mouth. She told you what, Mrs. Endicott? Miss Marple's voice was very gentle now. She confronted me. Before the party started, she found me in the garden. She said she knew I'd sent the letter. She'd recognized something about the handwriting, or perhaps the paper. She was furious. She said I'd always been jealous of her success, that I was just a bitter old woman trying to drag her down. She said that after the party, after she'd made her announcements, she'd make sure everyone knew what I'd done. She'd tell them I was a blackmailer, that I couldn't be trusted. She'd ruin me, and that's when you decided to kill her, Timothy said, his voice thick with emotion. No. Mrs. Endicott's denial was fierce. I didn't kill her. I swear I didn't. Yes, I was angry. Yes, I hated what she'd become. But I would never have harmed her. Not physically. Miss Marple studied her carefully. I believe you, Mrs. Endicott. You're not a murderer. But your confrontation with Mrs. Hartwell may have set other events in motion. You see, I don't think Mrs. Hartwell's death was premeditated. I think it was a crime of opportunity, committed by someone who seized an unexpected chance. Then who? Reginald demanded. If not Mrs. Endicott, then who killed Cecilia? Ah, Miss Marple said, rising from her chair with the aid of her cane. That is the question, isn't it? And to answer it, we need to return to Marple Cottage. There's something there. I need to verify something. I noticed on the evening of the party, but didn't fully appreciate at the time. Timothy, would you mind terribly if we all accompanied you back to the house?
Of course not. But Miss Motta, surely you can tell us who you suspect. I could, Miss Martle said, but I've been wrong before, and in matters of this gravity, one must be absolutely certain. So let us go and find our final proof.
Chapter 7. Another TWISD. The group made their way through the darkening streets of St. Mary Mead to Marple Cottage. A light rain had begun to fall, lending an ominous atmosphere to their procession. Timothy unlocked the front door and led them inside, turning on lights as they went. "Where do you want to go?" he asked Miss Marple. "To the back stairs, if you please, and I'll need everyone to gather in the hall." They assembled in the narrow hallway, an odd collection of people united by tragedy and suspicion. Miss Marple stood at the base of the stairs, looking up at the steep flight of steps. The rain pattered against the windows, and somewhere in the house, a clock ticked steadily. "Now," Miss Marple began, "let us reconstruct what happened." Mrs. Hartwell was in the drawing room with all her guests. Timothy began to play the piano. At some point during the performance, Mrs. Hartwell left the drawing room and came here, to these stairs. "Why? Because someone asked her to," Penelope said. "You already established that." "Yes, but who? And how?" The drawing room was crowded. Anyone speaking to Mrs. Hartwell would have been noticed. So the message must have been delivered some other way, a note, perhaps, or a whispered word at an earlier moment. But what could have been so urgent that it required Mrs. Hartwell to leave during her son's performance? Miss Marple began to climb the stairs slowly, testing each step. "I've been thinking about Mrs. Whittington's testimony. She said she saw a shadow near the library door movement that caught her eye. Everyone assumed that shadow was either Reginald Stern or the murderer. But what if it was something else entirely? What if it was a piece of fabric or a curtain moving in a draft?" She reached the top of the stairs and looked back down at the assembled group. "You see, this house is old, and old houses have many secrets. Hidden passages, priest holes, servants' stairs. I wondered if perhaps there was another way to reach this landing here. Way that wouldn't require one to be seen leaving the drawing room." "The servants' corridor," Timothy said suddenly. "There's a narrow passage that runs behind the walls, connecting the kitchen to the upstairs. We never use it, it's too cramped and dark. But it's there, precisely. And I believe that's how our murderer moved unseen through the house. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, let's consider what happened upstairs. Mrs. Hartwell climbed these stairs, difficult for her. But she persevered because she believed the matter was urgent. She reached this landing, and then what? Miss Marple walked along the upper hallway, her cane tapping softly. She stopped at a bedroom door, not Mrs. Hartwell's, but a guest room that appeared unused. "Timothy, whose room is this?" "It was meant for guests, but no one stayed here for months." "Why?" "Because I believe this is where Mrs. Hartwell was heading when she was killed. Look at the door, there's a small envelope on the floor, just inside. It must have been slipped under the door." Timothy pushed open the door and retrieved the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, written in a careful, anonymous hand. "I know what you're planning to announce tonight. Meet me in the blue guest room at 7:15 p.m. Come alone. I have information about your brother that you need to know before you make any public statements. This is urgent. Destroy this note." "She didn't destroy it," Reginald said, reading over Timothy's shoulder. "She came up here to meet whoever sent this, and they killed her." "Not quite," Miss Marple said. "I believe Mrs. Hartwell did intend to destroy the note, but she was attacked before she could do so. It fell from her hand and slid under the door, where it remained unnoticed. The murderer either didn't realize the note had fallen or had no time to retrieve it." "But who sent it?" Penelope asked. "And what was this information about Mr. Stern?" "There was no information," Miss Marple said. "It was simply a lure to get Mrs. Hartwell alone. As for who sent it, that's what we're here to determine. Timothy, could you fetch the note I asked you to retrieve from your mother's desk? The one about the London property. Timothy hurried off and returned moments later with the letter Miss Marple had examined earlier. She held it up beside the anonymous note, and even from a distance, the similarity was obvious. The handwriting was disguised, but certain characteristics remained the way the capital I was formed. The distinctive loop of the lowercase g, the angle of the script. The same person wrote both letters, Mrs. Price Ridley observed. Indeed. And if we examine Mrs. Hartwell's correspondence carefully, I believe we'll find other examples of this handwriting, because the person who wrote these letters had legitimate reasons to write to Mrs. Hartwell. They were someone she corresponded with regularly, someone she trusted. Miss Marple turned to face the group, and her eyes, usually so mild and gentle, had become sharp and penetrating. There's one more piece of evidence we need to examine. Timothy, in your mother's wardrobe, there's a hat box on the top shelf, green cardboard, with Madame Cecile, London printed on the lid. Would you fetch it, please? Timothy looked puzzled, but complied. He returned with the hat box and handed it to Miss Marple. She opened it carefully, and instead of a hat, it contained bundles of letters tied with ribbon. Your mother saved correspondence, Miss Marple said, particularly correspondence that she thought might prove useful. I suspected she would have kept certain letters that revealed secrets, letters that could be used for leverage. And here they are. She rifled through the bundles until she found what she was looking for, a collection of letters on expensive stationery. She extracted one and began to read aloud. My dear Mrs. Hartwell, I hope this letter finds you well. I am writing regarding the matter we discussed at Lady Pemberton's luncheon. I find myself in temporary financial difficulties, and I wondered if you might consider a short-term loan. I assure you it would be repaid with interest within the month. Your friend, Major Herbert Denton. Miss Marple looked up. This letter is dated 2 years ago. There are several others like it in this bundle, each requesting money, each promising repayment. And here she selected another letter. Is Mrs. Hartwell's draft response to the most recent request, dated last month. My dear Major, I regret that I cannot continue to provide funds for your gambling debts. I have been patient, but you have now borrowed nearly £15,000 with no sign of repayment. Unless the entire sum is returned within 90 days, I shall have no choice but to speak to our mutual friends about your situation. I'm sure you understand. A collective gasp ran through the group. Everyone turned to look at the empty space where Major Denton would have been standing had he been present. The Major's not here, Reginald said unnecessarily. No, Miss Marple agreed. He declined my invitation to tea, saying he had a prior engagement. But I think we all know where we need to go next. Inspector Slack was not pleased to be summoned from his supper, and he was even less pleased to find Miss Marple leading what he considered to be an amateur investigation. However, the evidence she presented, the note luring Mrs. Hartwell to her death, the handwriting comparison, and the letters revealing Major Denton's financial desperation was too compelling to ignore. They found the Major at his cottage, packing a suitcase. He looked up when they entered, and the resignation on his face told its own story. I knew you'd work it out eventually, he said to Miss Marple. You always do, don't you? Clever old bird. Major Denton, Inspector Slack, said formally, I'm arresting you for the murder of Mrs. Cecilia Hartwell. The Major laughed bitterly. Murder, such an ugly word. I prefer to think of it as ... self-preservation. You pushed her down the stairs, Timothy said, his voice shaking with anger. You killed my mother for money. Not just for money, boy. For survival. Do you know what happens to a man of my standing when word gets out that he's a gambler and a debtor? I'd be ruined. Cecilia knew that. She was going to expose me unless I repaid every penny £15,000. Where was I supposed to get that kind of money? I'm living on an army pension and what little my investments yield. She was going to destroy me, so you destroyed her instead, Miss Marple said quietly. The Major's face hardened. She left me no choice. When she named me as Timothy's trustee in her new will, I thought it was an honor. But then she told me the truth that was a trap. She said that as a trustee, I'd be subject to financial scrutiny. The lawyers would examine my affairs. My debts would be discovered. She was going to use the position to expose me publicly, while maintaining her own hands-clean reputation. It was diabolical. So you sent the blackmail letter first, Miss Marple said, hoping to frighten her into silence. Yes, but it didn't work. She just became more determined. That's when I knew I had to act. During the party, I slipped away briefly and wrote that note about having information regarding Reginald. I knew it would intrigue her. She always wanted ammunition against her brother. I used the servants' passage to place it under the guest room door, then returned to the drawing room before anyone noticed my absence. And during Timothy's performance, you slipped away again, Miss Marple continued. You knew Mrs. Hartwell would come upstairs at 7:15, as the note specified. You waited for her at the top of the back stairs. The Major nodded slowly, his military bearing finally crumbling. She came up those stairs, panting and grimacing from the pain in her knee. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost, but then I thought about my reputation, my life, everything I'd lose if she carried out her threat. When she reached the top, she saw me and looked confused. Herbert, she said, what are you doing here? Where's the person who sent me the note? I told her I'd sent it. I told her we needed to talk privately. She started to turn away, to go back downstairs, and I just... I pushed her. The room was silent, except for the sound of rain against the windows. Timothy's face had gone white, and Penelope held his hand tightly. She fell backward. The Major continued, his voice distant now, as though recounting something that had happened to someone else. Tumbled down those steep stairs. I heard her neck break a terrible sound. I knew she was dead before she reached the bottom. I hurried back through the servants' passage, returned to the drawing room. I was only gone for perhaps 3 minutes. No one noticed. And when that fool Flora Whittington screamed, I came running with everyone else, playing the concerned friend. You almost succeeded, Inspector Slack said gruffly. If it weren't for Miss Marple's interference, we'd have ruled it an accident. Interference. The Major gave a weak smile. No, Inspector. Miss Marple simply did what she always does, she observed, human nature. I should have known better than to commit murder in St. Mary Mead. This village belongs to her, in a way. Nothing escapes her notice. I noticed only small things, Miss Marple said gently. The fact that you were so quick to organize everyone after the body was found, establishing yourself as a helpful presence. The way you encouraged the accident theory. The fact that Mrs. Hartwell had consulted you about the blackmail letter, which meant you knew she wouldn't be intimidated. And most tellingly, the handwriting in her correspondence. You'd written to her so many times asking for money that your hand was familiar to me, even when disguised. The Major looked at her with something approaching respect. You're wasted in this village, Miss Marple. You should have been with the police. Oh, I don't think so. I'm quite content where I am, though I do wish people would stop committing murders. It's most inconvenient. As Inspector Slack led Major Denton away, the others stood in stunned silence. The rain had intensified, drumming on the roof like a judgment from heaven. Finally, Timothy spoke. I still can't believe it. The Major was my godfather. He taught me to ride a bicycle. How could he kill my mother over money? People kill for many reasons, Miss Marple said softly. Pride, fear, desperation. The Major had built his entire identity on being a respectable gentleman, a decorated soldier, a pillar of society. The thought of being exposed as a gambler and debtor was more than he could bear. He chose murder over humiliation. But surely there were other options, Penelope said. He could have borrowed money elsewhere, could have declared bankruptcy, could have faced the truth, Miss Marple finished. But that's the one thing he couldn't do. You see, my dear, the Major had spent so many years maintaining his facade that he'd come to believe in it himself. The real man, the one with weaknesses and debts, was someone he couldn't acknowledge. Your mother, Timothy, threatened to strip away that facade. She threatened to show the village the truth. For a man like Major Denton, that was a fate worse than death. Reginald Stern, who had been silent throughout the revelation, now spoke. Cecilia always did know how to find people's pressure points. She knew mine, the fear that I'd never amount to anything without her money. She knew Timothy's, the fear of losing his inheritance. And she knew the Major's, the fear of exposure. She wielded those fears like weapons. That doesn't excuse what the Major did, Timothy said sharply. No, it doesn't. Murder is never excusable. But it does help explain it. Cecilia wasn't an evil woman, but she was a controlling one. She couldn't bear not to have power over the people around her. Eventually, she pushed someone too far. Mrs. Endicott, who had been quietly crying throughout the Major's confession, now looked up with red-rimmed eyes. This is my fault. If I hadn't sent that first letter, if I hadn't threatened to expose her secrets, she might not have become so determined to make her announcements. She might not have threatened the Major. She might still be alive. You mustn't think that way, Miss Marple said firmly. The Major made his own choices, just as Mrs. Hartwell made hers. We cannot control how others respond to our actions. We can only choose our own behavior and hope for the best. You sent your letter out of concern for others, not malice. That matters, does it? A woman is still dead. A woman is dead because a man chose murder over honesty. That responsibility lies with Major Denton alone. Chapter 8. Miss Marple's final TSD the following day dawned clear and bright, as though the storm had washed away all the darkness of the previous weeks. Miss Marple sat in her garden, enjoying the autumn sunshine and reviewing the case in her mind. She had solved the mystery, identified the murderer, and seen justice done. Yet something still troubled her. Small inconsistency that she couldn't quite resolve. She was pondering this when Dr. Haydock appeared at her garden gate. Miss Marple, I've been looking for you. I've just come from the police station. Major Denton has made a full confession. And Inspector Slack, though it pains him to admit, it says your deductions were absolutely correct. Though he'd prefer if you called them lucky guesses in public. Miss Marple smiled. I'm quite content to let the inspector take all the credit. I have no need for glory. I thought you'd say that. But there's something else. Something the Major said in his confession that struck me as odd. He said that when Mrs. Hartwell reached the top of the stairs, She seemed surprised to see him. She said, "Herbert, what are you doing here? Where's the person who sent me the note?" As if she expected to meet someone else. Miss Marple's needles paused mid-stitch. "How very interesting. What do you make of that?" "Well, it suggests she didn't recognize his handwriting in the note, doesn't it? But you said the handwriting was similar to his letters to her." "Similar, yes, but not identical. The Major was clever enough to disguise his hand. Mrs. Hartwell wouldn't have come upstairs if she'd known it was the Major who wanted to meet her. She'd have simply confronted him in the drawing room. No, she thought the note was from someone else. Someone she wanted to meet privately. Who?" Miss Marple resumed her knitting. "That's what's been troubling me. The note mentioned having information about Reginald Stern. Who would Mrs. Hartwell expect might have such information? Who had been observing Reginald closely enough to discover his secrets?" Dr. Haydock frowned in thought. Mrs. Endicott. She knew the family well. Mrs. Endicott had already revealed her knowledge by sending the blackmail letter. No, this had to be someone else. Someone Mrs. Hartwell trusted, someone whose information she'd value. Miss Marple's eyes grew distant. Someone like Penelope Graves, perhaps. Miss Graves. But she's just a secretary. How would she have information about Reginald Stern? She works at the solicitor's office in Much Benham, the same firm that handles the Stern family's legal matters. She would have access to financial records, property documents, all manner of confidential information. And she's been courting Timothy for 6 months. Mrs. Hartwell might have suspected Miss Graves of snooping through files to learn about the family's affairs. Dr. Haydock looked troubled. "Are you suggesting Miss Graves was somehow involved in the murder?" No. The Major acted alone, of that I'm certain. But I do wonder if Miss Graves inadvertently gave him the idea. You see, the Major needed a way to lure Mrs. Hartwell upstairs without arousing suspicion. What better way than to imply that her son's unsuitable girlfriend had discovered damaging information about the family? Mrs. Hartwell would have wanted to confront such a situation immediately, before any announcements were made. So the Major was using Miss Graves as an unwitting decoy. Precisely. He knew Mrs. Hartwell's prejudices, her fears, her priorities. He exploited them expertly. But there's something else that's been nagging at me. Miss Marple set down her knitting and looked directly at Dr. Haydock. The Major's confession was very complete, very detailed. Almost too perfect. It's as though he'd rehearsed it. Perhaps he had. He must have known he'd be caught eventually. Perhaps. But there was one detail that didn't quite fit. He said Mrs. Hartwell was panting and grimacing from the pain in her knee when she reached the top of the stairs. How would he know that? If he was waiting at the top, hidden, he wouldn't have been able to see her climbing. And if he'd been visible, she would have seen him and been on her guard. Dr. Haydock's expression changed. Unless he was watching from somewhere else. The landing has a window that overlooks the back garden. If he'd been outside. Exactly what I was thinking. Dr. Haydock, I wonder if you'd indulge me in a small experiment. Could we go to Marple Cottage? There's something I'd like to test. They found Timothy at home, still sorting through his mother's belongings. He agreed readily to Miss Marple's request to examine the back stairs once more. Miss Marple positioned herself at the bottom of the stairs, while Dr. Haydock went outside to the garden. She asked Timothy to climb the stairs slowly, as his mother would have done with her bad knee. After a few minutes, Dr. Haydock returned, shaking his head. I can't see the stairs from the garden window. The angle is wrong. The window looks out over the roses, not down at the stairs, as I suspected. So the Major couldn't have seen Mrs. Hartwell climbing, which means his description of her panting and grimacing must have been an assumption, a logical one, given her knee problems, but an assumption nonetheless. "I don't understand," Timothy said. "Does this change anything?" "It confirms something," Miss Marple replied. "The Major's confession is genuine. He's not covering for anyone else, not protecting an accomplice. He simply described what he thought must have happened, based on his knowledge of Mrs. Hartwell's condition. It's a small detail, but in matters of murder, small details can be crucial. They can mean the difference between one killer and two, between a crime of passion and a calculated plot." She smiled gently at Timothy. "Your mother's murder was a spontaneous act by a desperate man, not a conspiracy. That should give you some comfort, at least. The Major acted alone, driven by fear and self-preservation. It wasn't personal, though I know that doesn't make it any less painful." Timothy nodded slowly. "Thank you, Miss Marple, for everything. I know Mother would have appreciated your thoroughness, even if she wouldn't have admitted it." As Miss Marple walked home through the village, she reflected on the case. It had been, in many ways, a typical murder born of fear, fueled by desperation, executed in a moment of terrible decision. The Major had destroyed himself trying to preserve his reputation, and in doing so, had become exactly what he'd feared being exposed as. A man without honor. But there were lessons to be learned beyond the obvious. Mrs. Hartwell's desire for control had ultimately contributed to her death. Mrs. Anderson's well-meaning interference had complicated matters. Timothy's rebellion against his mother's plans had created tensions that the Major had exploited. Everyone involved had played a part in creating the circumstances that led to murder, even if only one person had actually committed the crime. That evening, Miss Marple received a visit from Inspector Slack. He stood awkwardly in her parlor, holding his hat and looking as though he'd rather be anywhere else. "I've come to thank you," he said gruffly, "for your help with the Hartwell case. Though I still maintain that if you'd left it to the professionals, we'd have reached the same conclusion eventually." "I'm quite sure you would have, Inspector. You're a very capable officer." "Yes, well, the Major's been formally charged. He'll stand trial, though with his confession, it's likely to be straightforward. He's asked to see you, actually. Says he wants to apologize." Miss Marple considered this. "I think not, Inspector. I'm not the one he wronged. If he wishes to apologize, he should direct those words to Timothy Hartwell. I told him as much." He said, and, I quote, "Miss Marple will understand why I can't do that. Some apologies are too inadequate to be spoken." Inspector Slack shrugged. "Make of that what you will." After the inspector left, Miss Marple sat for a long time in her favorite chair, watching the shadows lengthen across her garden. She thought about Major Denton, who had spent his life maintaining a facade and had ultimately sacrificed everything, including his soul, to preserve it. She thought about Mrs. Hartwell, who had climbed so high from such humble beginnings, only to be brought low by her own need for control. And she thought about human nature, that endlessly fascinating subject that had occupied her attention for so many years. People were capable of such kindness and such cruelty, often in equal measure. They built elaborate defenses to protect their secrets, erected walls to keep others out, created personas to hide their true selves. And sometimes, when those defenses were threatened, they lashed out with tragic consequences. The case was closed. Justice had been served, and life in St. Mary Mead would gradually return to normal. But Miss Marple knew that beneath the surface tranquility, the same human dramas were always playing out, the same jealousies, ambitions, fears, and desires that had motivated people since the beginning of time. It was, she reflected, what made life interesting, and what kept her knitting needles clicking and her sharp eyes watching, always watching for the next small detail that would unlock the next great mystery. Chapter 9. The irreveal 3 weeks after Major Denton's arrest. Miss Marple found herself once again invited to Marple Cottage. Timothy had asked her to tea, along with a small group of others who had been involved in the case. It was, he said, a way of bringing closure to a difficult chapter. The gathering was subdued compared to Mrs. Hartwell's fatal garden party. Penelope Graves was there, sitting close to Timothy with a protective air. Reginald Stern attended, looking more at peace than Miss Marple had ever seen him. Mrs. Endicott had declined the invitation, sending word that she preferred to remember happier times. Dr. Haydock came, and the rector, Mr. Clement. Even Inspector Slack made a brief appearance, drawn perhaps by the promise of Miss Marple's presence and the possibility of tying up any remaining loose ends. "I wanted to thank you all," Timothy began, once everyone was settled with tea. "These past weeks have been the most difficult of my life. My mother's death, the revelation of the Major's crime, the exposure of so many family secrets, it's been overwhelming. But with your help, especially yours, Miss Marple, I've been able to find some peace." "You're very kind, dear," Miss Marple said, "but I merely observed what was there to be seen. The truth has a way of emerging eventually, with or without my assistance." "I'm not so sure about that," Timothy said. Inspector Slack was convinced it was an accident. If you hadn't persisted, the Major might have gotten away with murder. Inspector Slack shifted uncomfortably. Now, let's not exaggerate. I had my doubts about the accident theory. I was conducting a thorough investigation. "Of course you were, Inspector," Miss Marple said soothingly, though her eyes twinkled with amusement. Reginald Stern spoke up, his voice thoughtful. "I've been thinking a great deal about Cecilia, about who she really was beneath all the pretensions. The village knew her as Mrs. Hartwell, the grand lady, but she started life as Cecilia Perkins, the grocer's daughter. Everything she became, she built through sheer determination and will. That's actually rather admirable in its way." "It is," Miss Marple agreed. "Your sister was a remarkable woman. Her methods were sometimes questionable, and her need for control was ultimately destructive, but she achieved what few women of her background could have. She raised herself up through intelligence and effort, and she raised me," Timothy added quietly. "Yes, she was controlling and snobbish, but she also made sure I had every advantage, the best education, opportunities she never had. She wanted me to have the life she'd fought so hard to achieve for our family." Penelope squeezed his hand. "She loved you, in her way. She just didn't know how to love without controlling." "That's very perceptive, Miss Graves," Miss Marple observed. "Love and control can become easily confused, especially for those who've had to fight for everything they've gained. Mrs. Hartwell learned early that to relax one's grip on life was to risk losing everything. She never learned that some things, love, loyalty, genuine respect, cannot be controlled. They must be freely given." "Speaking of freely given," Timothy said, reaching into his jacket pocket, "I've made some decisions about the estate. Uncle Reginald, I've instructed Mr. Galbraith to establish a trust fund that will provide you with a generous annual income, with no conditions attached. It's what should have been done years ago. Reginald looked stunned. Timothy, you don't have to. Yes, I do. Mother was wrong to control you through money. You're my uncle, and I want you to have the freedom to live your life as you choose. Paint, teach, do whatever makes you happy. Reginald's eyes glistened with unshed tears. Thank you, my boy. You're a better person than I am, than any of us are, really. And Miss Graves, Timothy continued, turning to Penelope with a smile, I hope you'll consider marrying me, without any concerns about trustees or conditional inheritances. I've had Mr. Galbraith revoke all of Mother's conditions. My inheritance is my own to do with as I please, and I please to spend my life with you if you'll have me. Penelope's face lit up with joy. Of course, I'll have you, though I would have married you even with the conditions. I love you, not your money. I know, Timothy said softly. That's why I want to marry you. There was a general murmur of congratulations and good wishes. Even Inspector Slack managed a gruff, well done, lad. Dr. Haydock raised his teacup in a toast to new beginnings and the triumph of love over adversity. As they drank to the sentiment, Miss Marple watched with satisfaction. This was the denouement she preferred not, the dramatic confrontation with the murderer, though, that had been necessary, but this quieter resolution where the living learned to move forward, where wounds began to heal, where life reasserted itself after death's interruption. Miss Marple, the rector said, I wonder if I might ask you a question that's been troubling me. As a man of the cloth, I grapple with concepts of sin and redemption. Major Denton committed a terrible crime, but he did so out of desperation rather than malice. Do you think he can be redeemed? Miss Marple was silent for a moment, her needles clicking softly as she considered her response. Mr. Clement, I believe that redemption is always possible, but it requires genuine repentance, not just regret at being caught, but true understanding of the harm one has caused. Major Denton will have years in prison to reflect on his actions. Whether he uses that time for genuine soul-searching or merely self-pity will determine whether redemption is possible for him. That's between him and God. What concerns me more is the living helping those harmed by his actions to heal and move forward. Well said, the rector murmured. Inspector Slack cleared his throat. There is one thing that still puzzles me, Miss Marple. How did you know to look for evidence of the Major's financial troubles? What made you suspect him specifically? Several small things, Inspector. First, there was his eagerness to establish the accident narrative. Bit too eager, I thought. Then there was his relationship with Mrs. Hartwell. He was often at Bramble Cottage, accepted into her inner circle, yet there was a certain tension in their interactions. I noticed it at the party. The way she spoke to him had an edge, almost proprietorial, as though she held some power over him. But the real clue was the blackmail letter. When Major Denton told us about it, he mentioned that Mrs. Hartwell had thrown it into the fire. How did he know that? The letter had been delivered during the garden party, and Mrs. Hartwell had shown it to him before the piano performance. But she couldn't have thrown it in a fire. At that moment there were no fires lit on a warm autumn evening. He must have seen her destroy it at some earlier time, or more likely, he invented that detail because he knew how he would have disposed of such a letter. It was a small slip, but telling. Remarkable, Dr. Haydock said. You notice things that no one else sees. I notice the same things everyone sees, Miss Marple corrected gently. I simply think about what they mean. It's all a matter of paying attention and understanding human nature. People are endlessly predictable once you understand their motivations. As the afternoon wore on, the conversation turned to lighter topics, the upcoming harvest festival, Mrs. Price Ridley's latest complaints about the village council, plans for Timothy and Penelope's wedding. The shadow of murder gradually receded, replaced by the everyday concerns and joys of village life. Before she left, Timothy drew Miss Marple aside. "There's something I need to tell you, something I couldn't say in front of the others. I've been going through Mother's papers, and I found something, a diary she kept when she was young, before she married my father. Would you like to see it?" Miss Marple followed him to the study, where he produced a small, worn notebook. The entries were in a young woman's hand, filled with hopes and dreams and observations about the world around her. "Look at this entry," Timothy said, pointing to a page. "It's from when she was 18. Miss Marple read aloud. "I went to the great house today to interview for the housekeeper's position. The butler looked down his nose at me, and the cook asked if I knew my place. But I do know my place. It's wherever I choose to make it. I won't be kept down by birth or circumstance. I'll rise as high as my wits and will can take me. And someday I'll have a house like this of my own. And I'll never have to bow and scrape to anyone again." She did it, Timothy said quietly. She achieved exactly what she set out to achieve. She had this house, this life, the respect of the village. But I don't think it made her happy. The diary entries from later years are all about maintaining position, controlling situations, managing people. There's no joy in them, no satisfaction, just endless vigilance. That's often the cost of building one's life around an image, rather than authentic relationships. Miss Marple observed, "Your mother achieved her goals, but she couldn't allow herself to enjoy them because she was always afraid of losing what she'd gained. It's a common tragedy, more common than most people realize." "I don't want to make the same mistake," Timothy said. "I want to live authentically, to value people for who they are, not what they can do for me." "Then you've learned the most important lesson your mother's death can teach," Miss Marple said gently. "And that's worth more than any inheritance." As Miss Marple walked home through the gathering twilight, she reflected on the case one final time. Justice had been served. Major Denton would face the consequences of his actions. The truth had been revealed, the secrets, all the deceptions, all the carefully constructed facades had crumbled. And most importantly, those left behind had found a path forward, a way to honor the dead while building better lives for themselves. It was, she thought, as good an ending as one could hope for in the aftermath of murder. The victim could not be brought back, but her death need not be meaningless if it taught the living to be better, kinder, more authentic in their dealings with one another. St. Mary Mead would heal, as it always did. The gossip would eventually fade. The scandal would become just another chapter in the village's long history, and life would go on, with all its small dramas and hidden complexities, waiting for the next keen observer to unravel its mysteries. Miss Marple smiled to herself as she entered her cottage. Her knitting basket awaited, and with it, the pleasant routine of her quiet life. But she knew, with the certainty born of long experience, that it was only a matter of time before another mystery presented itself. Human nature, after all, never changed. And where there was human nature, there would always be secrets to uncover, truths to reveal, and justice to be served. Chapter 10. AFTX. Months later, St. Mary Mead had largely forgotten about the tragedy at Marple Cottage. Or rather, the village had absorbed it into its collective memory. where it would be periodically resurrected in conversations that began with, "Do you remember when, ... and ended with head shaking and sighs. Miss Marple sat in her garden on a fine spring morning, watching the daffodils nod in the breeze and thinking about how quickly life reasserted itself after even the most tragic interruptions. The birds sang, the flowers bloomed, and people carried on with their daily routines as though nothing had changed. And yet, everything had changed for some. Major Herbert Denton had been tried, convicted, and sentenced to life imprisonment. The trial had been brief. His confession left little room for doubt or defense. The last Miss Marple had heard, he was in a prison somewhere in the Midlands, maintaining the dignity and bearing that had defined his public persona, even as he served his sentence for murder. Some people, she reflected, never could let go of their masks, even when there was no longer any point in wearing them. Timothy Hartwell and Penelope Graves had married in a small ceremony at St. Mary Mead Church. Miss Marple had attended, watching with pleasure as the young couple exchanged vows. There was a genuine warmth between them that had nothing to do with social position or financial considerations, exactly the sort of foundation on which a good marriage should be built. They lived at Marple Cottage now, though Penelope had insisted on redecorating extensively. "Too many sad memories," she'd told Miss Marple. "We need to make it feel like our home, not just the house where Timothy's mother died." It was, Miss Marple thought, a healthy attitude. One couldn't move forward while clinging to the past. Reginald Stern had surprised everyone by flourishing once freed from his sister's financial control. With his new allowance, he'd purchased a small art gallery in much. Ben, a man, was successfully selling both his own work and that of other local artists. Miss Marple had visited the gallery recently and found him animated and enthusiastic in a way she'd never seen before. Freedom, it seemed, agreed with him. Mrs. Endicott had left St. Mary Mead shortly after the trial. She'd sent Miss Marple a brief note explaining that the village held too many painful associations, that she needed a fresh start. She'd taken a position as companion to an elderly lady in Bath and seemed, by all accounts, content with her new situation. Miss Marple understood the impulse sometimes one needed distance from the scene of one's mistakes, even if those mistakes had been well-intentioned. The question of Mrs. Hartwell's true background had caused a brief sensation in the village, but less than one might have expected. Mrs. Price Ridley had been vocally scandalized, of course, declaring that she'd always known there was something not quite right about Mrs. Hartwell. But most of the village had taken a more charitable view. The general consensus seemed to be that Mrs. Hartwell had worked hard to better herself, and that, really, wasn't that rather admirable? England was changing, after all, and perhaps the old, rigid class boundaries weren't as important as they'd once been. Miss Marple had been pleased by this reaction. It suggested that the village, for all its adherence to tradition, was capable of growth and evolution. People were slowly learning to value substance over surface, character over pedigree. It gave her hope for the future. She was contemplating these pleasant thoughts when her maid announced, "A visitor, Inspector Slack," looking rather sheepish as he was shown into the garden. "Miss Marple," he said, settling himself on the offered chair with obvious discomfort. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all, Inspector. How lovely to see you. Will you take some tea?" "That would be most welcome, thank you." Once they were settled with tea and biscuits, Inspector Slack cleared his throat. "I've come to acknowledge something that's been weighing on my mind. The Hartwell case. If it weren't for your intervention, I would have ruled it an accident. Major Denton would still be free, and justice would not have been served. I owe you an apology for dismissing your concerns so readily." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Inspector, you were doing your job as you saw fit. I don't fault you for that. Nevertheless, I was wrong and you were right. I let my assumptions about what an elderly lady might or might not observe cloud my judgment. I won't make that mistake again. I'm very glad to hear it. Though I hope, for the sake of St. Mary Mead's peace and quiet, that there won't be many more opportunities for you to apply that lesson." Inspector Slack chuckled. "One can hope. Though I suspect that wherever you are, Miss Marple, mysteries have a way of presenting themselves." "I do seem to attract them rather," Miss Marple admitted, "though I can't imagine why. I'm just a harmless old woman who knits and gardens." "Harmless," Inspector Slack repeated with a snort. "That's the last word I'd use to describe you. Criminals should be terrified of you. Oh, I don't think I'm terrifying. I simply pay attention. That's all detective work really is, isn't it? Paying attention to the small details that others overlook. Understanding human nature and following the logical threads to their conclusion. You make it sound simple. In principle, it is simple. In execution, of course, it requires patience and careful thought. And a certain amount of life experience doesn't hurt. When you've lived as long as I have and observed as many people as I have, patterns begin to emerge. Human nature is remarkably consistent, you know. The same motivations drive people to act in similar ways across generations and circumstances." Inspector Slack finished his tea and rose to leave. "Well, I won't take up more of your time. I just wanted to say thank you, and that if you ever have concerns about a case in the future, I'll listen more carefully." "That's very gracious of you, Inspector. Though I do hope St. Mary Mead has seen its last murder for quite some time." After the inspector left, Miss Marple returned to her knitting. Her current project was a blanket for Timothy and Penelope's baby. Penelope was expecting in the autumn, and the young couple was understandably excited about becoming parents. The baby would grow up in Marple Cottage, playing in the gardens where his or her grandmother had once entertained the village's elite. Life continuing, cycling forward, always renewing itself as her needles clicked steadily. Miss Marple found herself thinking about the essential lesson of the Hartwell case. It wasn't about murder techniques or criminal psychology, though those were certainly present. It was about the cost of deception, both self-deception and the deception of others. Mrs. Hartwell had built her life on a foundation of lies about her origins, and those lies had required constant maintenance, constant vigilance. She'd become so focused on protecting her facade that she'd lost sight of what really mattered: genuine relationships, authentic connection, love without conditions. Major Denton had deceived himself about his gambling problem, about his financial situation, about the kind of man he really was beneath his military bearing and gentlemanly manner. When confronted with the truth about himself, he'd chosen murder rather than honest self-examination. Mrs. Endicott had deceived herself into thinking that blackmail could be justified if one's intentions were good, that threatening someone was acceptable if it was done out of concern rather than malice. Even Timothy had engaged in deception, hiding his relationship with Penelope from his mother rather than confronting her disapproval directly. All of these deceptions, large and small, had contributed to the tragedy at Marple Cottage. They'd created an atmosphere of secrets and hidden agendas, of unspoken resentments and suppressed truths. and in such an atmosphere, violence could flourish. The alternative, Miss Marple reflected, was radical honesty, the kind that Mrs. Hartwell had planned to unleash at her party. But there was a right way and a wrong way to speak truth. Mrs. Hartwell had intended to use truth as a weapon, to humiliate and control. That wasn't honesty. It was cruelty dressed in the garments of frankness. True honesty, Miss Marple believed, should be tempered with kindness. One could speak difficult truths without stripping away another person's dignity. One could be authentic without being brutal. The key was to speak from a place of genuine concern rather than a desire to wound or dominate, she thought. Timothy and Penelope understood this. They were building their marriage on a foundation of honest communication, sharing their thoughts and feelings openly while respecting each other's vulnerabilities. It was a healthier model than the one Mrs. Hartwell had demonstrated, and it gave Miss Marple hope that the next generation might do better than the last. A robin landed on the arm of her chair, regarding her with bright, curious eyes. Miss Marple smiled at it, remembering how her nephew, Raymond, always teased her about her affinity for birds and how they seemed to sense her gentle nature. "Well, my dear," she said softly to the robin, "what do you think? Have we learned anything from all this sadness?" The robin cocked its head, as if considering the question, then flew off to pursue its own concerns. Miss Marple watched it go with amusement. Birds, at least, were straightforward creatures. They didn't deceive themselves or others. They simply lived according to their nature, with neither pretense nor shame. If only humans could be so uncomplicated. But then, Miss Marple reflected, if humans were simple and straightforward, there would be no mysteries to solve, no puzzles to unravel, no opportunities to exercise one's powers of observation and deduction. And that, she had to admit, would make life considerably less interesting. She was just contemplating whether to make herself another cup of tea when she saw Dr. Haydock's car pull up to her gate. He emerged, carrying a basket and wearing an expression of mild concern. "Miss Marple, I'm glad I caught you at home. I've been visiting Timothy and Penelope insisted I bring you some preserves she's made. Apparently, you gave her the recipe. How thoughtful of her." "Do come in, Dr. Haydock. I was just about to make fresh tea." Once settled in her parlor with tea and a sampling of Penelope's quite creditable strawberry preserves, Dr. Haydock leaned back in his chair with a sigh. "I must say, those two seem remarkably happy. Penelope's positively glowing, though that might be the pregnancy. And Timothy has lost that haunted look he had after his mother's death. It's good to see, it is indeed. They're building something real together, something based on mutual respect and genuine affection. It's what marriage should be. Unlike Mrs. Hartwell's marriage to the Colonel, I suppose. I always wondered about that match. He was so much older than she was, and they seemed to have so little in common. I believe Mrs. Hartwell married for security and position rather than love," Miss Marple said carefully, "which doesn't mean the marriage was entirely without affection. The Colonel was, by all accounts, a kind man who treated her well, and she, in turn, was a devoted wife who managed his household expertly. There are worse foundations for a marriage. True enough, though I prefer to see young people marrying for love, as Timothy and Penelope have done, as do the first, though love alone isn't enough, must be accompanied by honesty, patience, and a willingness to see one's partner clearly, flaws and all. The trick is to love someone not despite their imperfections, but with full knowledge of them." Dr. Haydock regarded her with interest. "You're quite the philosopher, Miss Marple. Simply an observer of human nature, Doctor. When one has watched as many marriages as I have, successful ones and disasters alike, one begins to see patterns. Speaking of patterns, I've been meaning to ask you something. In the Hartwell case, you seemed to know from very early on that it was murder rather than an accident. What tipped you off? Miss Marple considered the question. Several things, really. The most significant was Mrs. Hartwell's character. She was a woman who carefully controlled every aspect of her life and her environment. The idea that she would carelessly fall downstairs she was known to fear struck me as deeply inconsistent with her personality. People don't change their fundamental nature suddenly. If Mrs. Hartwell had been a careless, impulsive person, an accidental fall might have made sense. But she wasn't. She was meticulous and cautious. And the shoes. You mentioned something about her shoes. Ah, yes. The uneven wear pattern suggested a physical issue, the bad knee, as we later confirmed. But what struck me was that her shoes at the party were relatively new, with minimal wear. Yet the wear pattern was already established. That told me she habitually favored one leg over the other, which meant climbing steep stairs would have been genuinely difficult and painful for her. She wouldn't have done it without compelling reason. The note from the Major, precisely, though I didn't know it was from the Major at that point. I simply knew that something must have lured her to those stairs. From there, it was a matter of determining who had the motive and opportunity to commit the crime. Dr. Haydock shook his head admiringly. You make it sound so logical, so inevitable. But I assure you, the rest of us were floundering in confusion. That's because you were looking at the big picture, the dramatic events, the obvious suspects. I've learned to focus on the small inconsistencies, the details that don't quite fit the narrative everyone else is accepting. Those little anomalies are usually where the truth hides. A useful lesson for a doctor, actually. Often the diagnosis everyone assumes is correct turns out to be wrong, because of some small symptom that doesn't fit the pattern. I should pay more attention to those anomalies. Indeed, you should, Doctor. In medicine, as in detection, the devil is in the details. After Dr. Haydock left, Miss Marple sat for a while longer in her parlour, surrounded by the comfortable clutter of her life books. Knitting, photographs of family and friends, mementos of travels and adventures long past. This was her world, small and domestic, far removed from the grand dramas of London or the exotic adventures one read about in novels. And yet, within this small world, she had witnessed the full range of human experience, love and hate, generosity and greed, courage and cowardice, wisdom and folly. She had seen how the great themes of existence played out in miniature in the everyday lives of ordinary people. The Hartwell case had been a perfect example. At its heart, it was a story about pride and fear, about the lengths to which people would go to protect their carefully constructed images of themselves. It could have happened anywhere, in London or Manchester or Paris, but it had happened here, in St. Mary Mead, and Miss Marple had been positioned to observe it, understand it, and ultimately to ensure that justice was served. She wondered sometimes if she had a responsibility to act in such cases. After all, she had no official standing, no legal authority. She was simply a curious old woman who noticed things. And yet, time and again, she found herself drawn into investigations, compelled by her sense of justice and her belief that truth mattered. Perhaps it was simply that she couldn't bear to see wickedness go unpunished or innocence falsely accused. Perhaps it was her faith in the essential importance of truth, even when that truth was painful. Or perhaps, if she was honest with herself, it was simply that she enjoyed the intellectual challenge of solving puzzles, of seeing through deceptions, of understanding the hidden motivations that drove people to act as they did. Whatever the reason, she knew she would continue to observe, to question, to unravel mysteries whenever they presented themselves. It was, in a sense, her vocation as much as the rector's calling was to minister to souls or the doctor's to heal bodies. Hers was to seek truth and see justice done. The afternoon shadows were lengthening now, and Miss Marple decided it was time to prepare her supper. She rose stiffly from her chairage, was making itself felt more with each passing year, and made her way to the kitchen as she worked, preparing a simple meal of cold chicken and salad. She found herself humming an old hymn she'd learned as a child. It was about light overcoming darkness, truth triumphing over falsehood, good ultimately prevailing over evil. Simple sentiments, perhaps naive in their optimism, but sentiments she still believed in despite having seen the worst that human nature could produce. Because for every Major Denton who chose murder over honesty, there was a Timothy Hartwell who chose love over ambition. For every Mrs. Hartwell who built her life on deception, there was a Penelope Graves who valued authenticity over social position. Darkness existed, certainly, but so did light. And in her small way, Miss Marple tried to ensure that the light prevailed, at least in St. Mary Mead. After supper, she returned to her knitting, working on the baby blanket as the evening deepened into night. The rhythmic click of her needles was soothing, meditative. As she worked, she thought about the child who would use this blanket, Timothy and Penelope's son or daughter. Growing up in a house marked by tragedy, but dedicated now to creating new, happier memories, the baby would never know its grandmother, would never experience Mrs. Hartwell's peculiar mixture of fierce love and suffocating control. In some ways, that was a loss. Every child deserved to know their grandparents. But in other ways, perhaps it was a blessing. The child would grow up free from the weight of Mrs. Hartwell's expectations, free to become whoever they chose to be without the burden of living up to someone else's image of perfection. And that, Miss Marple reflected, was perhaps the ultimate lesson of the case. People should be free to be themselves, to make their own choices, to live authentic lives without pretense or deception. The moment one started trying to control others, to force them into predetermined molds, trouble began. Mrs. Hartwell had learned that lesson too late. Miss Marple hoped that others might learn it from her example without having to pay such a terrible price. The clock struck 9, and Miss Marple set aside her knitting. It was time for bed. Tomorrow would bring its own small dramas and gentle pleasures, perhaps a visit to the vicarage, or tea with Mrs. Bantry, or simply a quiet day of gardening and reading as she climbed the stairs to her bedroom, much more slowly than she had climbed them in her youth. But safely, carefully, without fear, she said a small prayer for all those touched by the tragedy at Marple Cottage, for Mrs. Hartwell, that she might find peace wherever her soul had gone, for Major Denton, that his imprisonment might lead to genuine repentance and growth, for Timothy and Penelope and their coming child, that they might build a life of honesty and love, for Reginald Stern, that his newfound freedom might bring him happiness, and for Mrs. Endicott, that she might forgive herself for her well-intentioned mistakes. And finally, though she felt rather silly doing so, she said a small prayer of thanksgiving for her own life, for her health, her comfortable home, her many friends, and yes, even for the mysteries that came her way. They kept her mind sharp and gave her purpose. She was, in her own quiet way, useful. And that mattered. Miss Marple turned off her bedroom light and settled into bed, content in the knowledge that justice had been served, that truth had prevailed, and that St. Mary Mead could rest easy for another night. Tomorrow would bring whatever it would bring. But tonight, all was well in her small corner of the world, and that, she thought drowsily as sleep claimed her, was quite enough.